Twitter has played a vital role in not only Trump's campaigning, but it's actually fueled the entire US election. The social media giant has actually temporarily locked Donald Trump's account and has threatened to ban it if he continues to violate its policies. I want to discuss this with tech expert Trevor Long. Trevor, thanks so much for joining me. Social media now has extraordinary reach and extraordinary power. And in fact, it has been attributed with influencing political elections. Donald Trump's used it to his advantage, but now it's been working against him. How do you think this is going to play out in the long term in a political sense?
I think a lot of people look at today as being a bit too little too late for Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, blocking Donald Trump for 24 hours is kind of a message that what he's been doing perhaps isn't the right thing for society, let alone their platforms. And so just now, with the confirmation of Joe Biden, he's had to put out a statement through what you would deem a traditional channel, essentially a press alert. And it's had to be reported by others. If you could imagine Donald Trump actually had his accounts now, he'd be tweeting line after line, and as opposed to just a simple little message. So I think that what we've seen here is a very clear fundamental change in the way that elections are conducted. I mean, the narrative, the conversation that occurs in society is completely different to what it was just 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, when we kind of held our political beliefs to ourselves, whereas now, doesn't matter left or right, you are vocal, you are opposing people, you are sharing your shared thoughts, you're sharing the things that you believe in, and you're essentially negative about everything else. So it's a very, very vocal world now, unfortunately, and I think that the influence that has over the quiet majority who just watch these things, they watch these platforms like Facebook and Twitter, just like they watch TV. It's a non-engaging platform for them. And all those negative voices from either side are amplified, far outweighing the reality of those voices, I think.
Yes, I think you're right. It really hasn't brought people together as intended and may have polarised the electorate. But the tech giants, of course, have been accused of having particular favourites as well, and by applying filters and algorithm changes selectively. How accurate do you think some of those claims are, whereas, someone like Donald Trump may be censored or held to account for some of his statements, whereas other public figures seemingly get away with it without any repercussions whatsoever?
I think it's 100% accurate. And I think, I grew up naively not realising there was essentially forms of bias in newspapers, for example, and people kind of understand the leanings of a particular newspaper as an example. The same applies with these platforms. They are able to manipulate what we all see through their own algorithms. Now, they might not specifically say, oh, if you're a member of the Republican Party, push it this way, or if you're a Liberal or Labor here in Australia, push it that way. But they're able to look at the way that different party operatives essentially communicate with each other and the style of things that happen. So if someone's more prone from the left to get a lot of likes as opposed to comments, then likes become a positive engagement tactic as opposed to comments. They can do amazing things to manipulate what we see. You've got to remember, I don't think on any social network anymore are you seeing a true representation of even the voices of the people you follow, because they can be drowned out by more vocal members of that group that you follow. So I do think we need to shine a light and a very clear light on the tech companies and our reliance on them for information.
Well, I'm going to get to that in a moment, but if I could ask you about this. I read something today on the International Monetary Fund website where they're now suggesting that big data and the tech companies themselves will be applying different tests to assess people's creditworthiness. So it's no longer just about paying your bills. It's no longer about having a salary. It's going to be determined by what you search for, the browser that you may use, what you click on. Is this a step too far where your financial requirements may be influenced by your political or your private interests?
I think people would be shocked to think that it was anything more than just, income versus expenditure that determined your ability to pay off a loan and your previous history with other credit applications playing a role. The very fact that you're spending, let's say, for example, Cory, and this is not reported, but let's just say, for example, you spend more time on shopping websites than you do on productivity websites. Could that count against you because you're more likely to spend money, you're more likely to be an impulse buyer, and therefore your discretionary budget is more susceptible to risk? Those things should absolutely not play a role in the way any decisions about our finances are made, unless it's fully disclosed. And I think insurance is a good example. There are insurance companies today who say, look, we'll give you a better deal if you tell us everything. Like, how often are you driving? How many kilometres are you driving? And where do you keep the car? Whereas other companies are like, where do you live? That's all we need to know. If you're willing to give over the information and there's a benefit, great. But it shouldn't be the default. It should be an opt-in situation.
And this is the problem, Trevor, is honestly there's so much data that has been harvested without our knowledge, without effectively our permission, and yet it's been used against us and in ways in which people could never really envisage. So it prompts the question, do we need to control the rise of tech giants in the way they access data, manipulate data, and manipulate what we can see and use and hear?
Full credit to the ACCC for the way they've looked at different parts of these organisations and their influence on things like media and our access to that content. But it needs to go deeper. It needs to look at, and let's be clear, this is not the fault of anyone, because no one foresaw Facebook becoming this thing. We just thought it was a way to share photos with your family and friends. Google was just a search engine. But when they became data-driven financial operatives, it had to have an impact on the way they treat us as citizens. So I do think that we could probably lead the world in looking at how these companies influence society and the way we engage with them and the amount of information they gather about us, how much influence we genuinely have around the world, and whether or not we can have an impact is a bigger problem and a bigger question. This needs to be a global problem, and that whole monopoly idea and breaking up these companies into their smaller parts may well be the only way forward.
Yeah, when the writing was on the wall when Google dropped its tagline, "Don't be evil,"